7 kilometers. That's the number that emptied a village. The night of June 28, 2026, a wildfire sat roughly 7 kilometers west of the Fort Simpson airport, and the people whose job it is to watch these things knew exactly what that meant. A fire doesn't crawl at some polite, predictable pace. It breathes. It waits for the wind. A stretch of dry boreal forest between a flame front and a runway can disappear in a single afternoon if the weather turns on you. Fort Simpson is small, around 1,200 people, going by the 2021 census. A village planted where two of Canada's biggest rivers slam together, the Mackenzie and the Liard, at a spot the Dene have called DLK for longer than anyone can measure. The name means the place where the rivers come together. Hold on to that phrase. It matters more by the end of this than it does right now. So here's the first thing I want you to keep, because we don't get to the answer for a while. When those flames were bearing down that night, nobody could tell you whether the village would still be standing come morning. Not the fire crews, not the mayor, not the elders who'd lived through bad seasons and figured they knew what bad looked like. That question sat over everything. Could a community of 1,000-odd people, stranded on an island at a river junction, ride out a blaze that was closing the gap one gust at a time? And here's the second thing. Smaller, uglier, harder to say out loud. Because before the fire ever reached 7 kilometers from that airport, before the evacuation order went out, some accounts say this fire season had already taken lives in the Dehcho. We'll get there. I won't rush it. But tuck it in the back of your mind, because it changes how you hear the fear in Fort Simpson that night. Let me set the scene properly. Reports point to lightning. Nothing exotic about that in the Northwest Territories. Late June, dry ground, a storm rolls through, and the sky drops a spark into forest that hasn't tasted real rain in weeks. The blaze was first spotted, by some accounts, about 9 kilometers west of the airport. By June 28, it had reportedly closed to around 7. 2 kilometers of progress. Doesn't sound like much, until you understand what boreal forest does once it catches. The airport itself, call sign IFS, that's the real IATA code, sits southeast of the community. It's the lifeline. When you live in a village where summer road access runs through a river ferry, that runway is how the sick get out, how crews and equipment come in, how the whole place stays tied to the rest of the world. A fire threatening the airport isn't just threatening trees, it's threatening the door. Picture the geography for a second, because it's the whole story. Fort Simpson sits on an island, Mackenzie on one side, Liard on the other, the two of them meeting right there. In summer, you cross the Liard by ferry. In winter, an ice crossing. There's no bridge you can just floor it across when the sky goes orange. So when the order came to leave, it wasn't as simple as pointing 1,000 people at a highway and saying go. And the order came. Full evacuation of Fort Simpson. Everybody out. Some accounts put the moment it was issued around 7:10 on the evening of June 28, with the fire reportedly 7 kilometers from the airport by then. Whether that exact time is right or not, the sequence isn't in dispute. The fire got close enough, fast enough, that officials decided they couldn't gamble 1,000 lives on a single island at a river confluence. Think about what that night actually looked like on the ground. You've got families throwing what they can into the back of a truck. Photos off the wall, maybe. The dog. The medications. The documents that prove you exist. You've got a line building at the ferry, because that ferry is the road out, and reports describe it running to move people through the smoke. You've got that low roar somewhere to the west that everyone keeps glancing toward. And that particular light in the sky at night that tells you the fire is close. Not a sunset, not a storm. Something that pulses and glows on the underside of the clouds. Not everyone in Fort Simpson owns a vehicle. That's a detail city people forget. In a village this size, plenty of folks, elders especially, people in long-term care, families without a working truck, depend on somebody else to get them out. Accounts describe residents with no transportation of their own being flown toward Yellowknife, the territorial capital, roughly 600 to 630 kilometers east by road. That's a real distance. That's how far these people had to be scattered just to be safe. And I keep coming back to the elders, because there's a thread running through this whole story about the ones who wouldn't leave, or couldn't, or chose the community over their own comfort. Some accounts describe Herb Norwegian, a real long-serving Grand Chief of the Dehcho First Nations, staying behind as the evacuation emptied the village around him. I'll be straight with you, I can't independently confirm every detail of that, but it fits everything you learn about how these northern communities move when the worst shows up. Somebody stays. Somebody always stays. Now let me hand you the piece that turns a scary night into a genuine crisis. At the moment that order went out, the fire was reportedly a few kilometers from the airport and still growing. Not contained. Not slowing. The wind was doing what wind does in a fire season the North hadn't seen since 2023. And if you know anything about 2023, you know that was the year Yellowknife itself, the capital, had to be evacuated. 20,000 people down a single highway. That's the ghost hanging over every fire manager in the territory. That's the memory in the room the second somebody says the word evacuate. So the village emptied. The lights went dark. And out past the tree line, 7 kilometers in closing, the fire kept eating ground in the dark. Here's the part nobody standing on that ferry dock knew yet. This wasn't the worst night. Not even close. Because what the fire did in the days that followed, how far it exploded, what it jumped, how close it came to erasing the whole thing, makes 7 kilometers sound like a comfortable distance. 13,000 hectares. That's the number the reports keep pointing to for what this fire became within a day or two of that evacuation night at the end of June 2026. Let it land for a second. A fire that had been sitting 7 kilometers out, a distance you could almost talk yourself into calling safe, didn't just creep closer. It detonated. Blew outward across a stretch of boreal forest that had been curing under weeks of heat and wind. And the terrain gave it everything. Black spruce packed tight, the kind of tree that practically begs to burn, resin-heavy needles catching like matchsticks. Dry moss underfoot. A landscape that spent thousands of years learning how to carry flame from one horizon to the next. When the wind pushed, the fire ran. Not walked. Ran, then it did the thing every fire manager on the Dehcho fire line dreads most. It reached Highway 1. You have to understand what that road is to Fort Simpson. It isn't just a highway. In summer, with the Liard River ferry running, that ribbon of gravel and pavement is the umbilical cord. The one land route connecting the village to the rest of the Northwest Territories, to Wrigley, 200-some kilometers up the Mackenzie corridor, to the long haul east toward Yellowknife, 600 kilometers away. Reports suggest the fire crossed that highway. Think about what that means tactically. Once flame jumps your control line, once it's burning on both sides of the only road out. Your escape route and your fire line become the same fragile thread. Crews can get boxed. Evacuation windows can slam shut in the time it takes the wind to swing 15 degrees. It didn't stop at the highway. Accounts describe the fire pushing all the way to the village landfill. The dump. And if that sounds almost mundane next to the drama of a highway crossing, sit with the geography for a moment, because the landfill sits close. Close enough that when a wildfire reaches it, you're no longer talking about a fire near the community. You're talking about a fire at the doorstep. The buffer is gone. The comfortable math of kilometers has collapsed into a much uglier unit. Meters, some accounts put the flame front at around 300 meters from homes. 300 meters. Shorter than most people's morning walk to the mailbox. 3 football fields laid end to end. And on the far side of it, on a night lit orange by something that had already swallowed 13,000 hectares, sat the houses of a village where reports placed the population somewhere around 1,200 people. Empty houses now, thankfully, the evacuation order had already pulled the residents out. But empty doesn't mean it doesn't matter. Every one of those homes held a life. Photos on the fridge, a grandmother's chair, the stuff that never shows up in a hectare count, but is the entire reason anyone fights a fire at all. Now here's what I want you to really feel about that 300-meter moment, because it's the hinge the whole story turns on. At 300 meters, luck is doing at least as much work as skill. You can lay every hose, cut every guard, soak every rooftop, and still, if that wind holds its heading for another hour, the ember cast alone can leapfrog your defenses and start spot fires in the yards behind you. Wildfire doesn't need to march the front line up to your door. It throws burning debris ahead of itself, sometimes hundreds of meters, and each ember that lands on dry ground is a brand new fire, opening a second front in your backyard. At 300 meters with the wind at its back, Fort Simpson was, by any honest reading, one bad gust from catastrophe. And then the wind shifted. I won't dress it up as destiny, because it wasn't. It was weather. Cold, indifferent physics. But the direction the wind chose in that window is the difference between a village that made it and a village that became a headline in the same grim tradition as everything this channel keeps documenting. The Colorado drying faster than anyone predicted. The Outer Banks homes dropping into the Atlantic, 16 in a single 6-week stretch. Whole American towns going dry one reservoir at a time. Fort Simpson was staring down its own entry in that ledger. The wind moved, and it didn't get one. That's the part that should make your stomach drop, honestly, not the heroism. The randomness. The fact that a community of 1,200 people at the confluence of two great rivers survived in part because air pressure over the boreal forest nudged a few degrees the right way on the right night. But don't mistake the wind for the whole story, because underneath that lucky break was an enormous amount of human grind that made the luck survivable. When the wind gives you an opening, you have to be positioned to use it, and being positioned meant crews. Lots of them. Hauled in from far outside the territory. Reports describe firefighters rotating through from the BC Wildfire Service, British Columbia's provincial agency, one of the most experienced wildland outfits on the continent. Accounts also point to Yukon crews in the mix. This is how the Canadian system is built to work. When one region's fires outrun its own people, mutual aid pulls resources across provincial and territorial lines, coordinated through the kind of interagency machinery that exists precisely for a summer like this one. A summer where accounts describe over 200 fires burning across the Northwest Territories at once. 200. Every one of them competing for the same finite pool of pilots, pumps, and exhausted bodies. And exhausted is the right word. Picture the actual labor. Crews working 16-plus hour shifts in smoke thick enough to sting your lungs through a respirator. In heat radiating off a fire front, dragging hose line by hand through terrain that fights you every step. Reports mention something on the order of 20,000 feet of sprinkler hose being deployed as protection. That's roughly 6 kilometers of line, laid out to throw a curtain of water over the structures and ground that mattered most. 6 kilometers. Coiled, hauled, connected, pressurized, monitored, moved, by hand. In the dark. Beside a fire. That's the unglamorous truth of how a village survives a night like the one at the end of June 2026. Not a single dramatic gesture. Thousands of small ones, stacked. By people running on adrenaline and instant coffee, rotating out only when their bodies quit, and a fresh crew from BC or the Yukon stepped up to take the line. And here's the complication that keeps this from being a clean victory. A wind shift and a wall of sprinklers don't put a fire out. They buy you a standoff. A fragile one. Because a fire that's already crossed a highway and reached a landfill and swelled past 13,000 hectares isn't beaten by one good night. It backs off. It smolders. It waits for the next dry afternoon and the next favorable wind to test your lines all over again. Which is exactly what it did. The 13,000 hectares reports described from those first frantic days were not the ceiling. not remotely. Over the weeks that followed, that number kept climbing, kept eating boreal forest in the country north and west of the village, until it reached a figure that makes the near miss at the landfill look like the opening act of something far larger. So the village held, barely, on luck and hose and the bone-deep exhaustion of crews who'd traveled hundreds of kilometers to stand between a fire and someone else's home. But the people of Fort Simpson were still scattered, flown out, driven out, waiting in Yellowknife and beyond, phones in hand, refreshing for any word, and the fire behind them was still growing. July 24. 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That's the moment the word finally came. The evacuation alert, the last tier of warning still hanging over Fort Simpson, was lifted. After weeks of scattered families, after nights spent watching a glow on the horizon that nobody could look away from, the people who'd been told to run were told they could come home. Reports describe the most vulnerable residents allowed back first, the long-term care residents, the elders, the ones for whom every extra day away carried its own quiet cost. They came home before anyone else. There's something right about that. In a village that carries the Dene name, DLK, the place where the rivers come together, the elders returned to the confluence first. Think about what that return actually looked like. Not a parade. Not a celebration with banners. Fort Simpson sits on an island at the meeting of the Mackenzie and the Liard, and in summer, the only way onto that island by road runs across the Liard River ferry. So coming home meant lining up at the water's edge, waiting for the ferry to carry you across the same current that has defined this place for as long as anyone has lived here. The river that isolates the village is also the road that brings it back to life. On July 24, that ferry was carrying people home through air that reports say still smelled of smoke. Because here's the part that refuses to fit neatly into a happy ending. The fire wasn't out. It still isn't. Even as the alert lifted, even as families crossed back onto the island, the blaze that had chased them out was reportedly sitting at around 56,000 hectares. 56,000. Put that number next to the 13,000 that terrified everyone during those first frantic nights at the landfill, and you start to grasp how much country this fire swallowed while the village waited. Roughly 138,000 acres of boreal forest, burned or burning, out in the bush north and west of town. The threat to the homes eased. The fire did not. And this is the thing people misunderstand about a boreal fire. It doesn't die the way a campfire dies, with a hiss and a wisp of steam. In this country, fire goes underground. It burrows into root systems and thick beds of peat and old duff, and it smolders down there, slow, patient, nearly invisible, for weeks, sometimes for months. Crews call them holdover fires. Some people call them zombie fires, because they can vanish from the surface entirely and then claw their way back up when the wind and the heat return. So when the residents of Fort Simpson crossed back over the Liard on July 24, they weren't returning to a threat that was gone. They were returning to a threat that had simply lain down, which is why the work didn't stop when the people came back. Reports describe the crews shifting into the long, unglamorous phase, mop up. The BC Wildfire Service teams and the Yukon crews who'd rotated through those brutal shifts were, by late July, reportedly rotating out, handing the fire off to fresh unit crews for the slow business of hunting hotspots, digging into smoldering ground, drowning what the eye can't even see. No wind shift saves you from this part. It's just labor, boot after boot, hose after hose, across scorched country, chasing a fire that's learned to hide. Go back to that first night for a second. June 28. The evacuation order dropping in the evening. The fire reportedly 7 kilometers west of the airport. The whole village suddenly a line of taillights and packed trucks. Some people flown out because they had no vehicle of their own. Everyone asking the same unanswerable question, will there be anything to come back to? That question hung over every one of the weeks that followed. It hung over the landfill standoff, It hung over the wind that tested the lines again and again. On July 24, that question finally got an answer. And the answer was yes. There's a village to come home to. Not because the fire was beaten. It wasn't. Because a wind turned at the right moment. And because crews from hundreds of kilometers away stood in front of homes that weren't theirs. And because the ground held while it mattered most. The margin was thin. Reports of the fire reaching within a few hundred meters of the community edge tell you exactly how thin. But thin is enough. Thin is the difference between a village that grieves and a village that gathers. I keep coming back to that image, the ferry, running across the Liard, carrying elders home first. Because it says something about how this place survived that a bigger, richer, more connected town might not understand. Fort Simpson is small. Around 1,000 people, give or take, depending on which count you trust. It's remote, roughly 600 kilometers of road from Yellowknife, out at the far end of a highway that the fire had reportedly crossed. When the crisis hit, there was no cavalry hiding just over the hill. There was the river, the ferry, the crews who came, and the people themselves, holding on to each other from wherever they'd been scattered. The smoke will thin out over the coming weeks. The hot spots will get chased down one by one. That 56,000 hectares of burned country will green up eventually. Boreal forest is built to burn and built to return, and the next generation of trees is already coated into the ash. But the people crossing back over the Liard in late July weren't thinking about ecology. They were thinking about their own front doors, still standing at the place where the rivers meet. The fire is still out there, breathing under the ground. The village is still here, above it. And on an island at the confluence of two great rivers, both of those things are true at once. A community that ran into the dark and, weeks later, rode a ferry home through the smoke to find that home was still waiting.